I was getting a haircut when the barber asked if I came here alone. The scissors stopped mid-cut, and Marcus held them suspended near my ear, his reflection in the mirror staring at me with an intensity that made my scalp prickle. The question hung in the air between us like smoke, seemingly innocent but weighted with something I couldn't identify. "Did you come here alone today?" He asked it casually, but his eyes were locked on mine in the mirror with an expression that felt like a warning. I'd walked into Precision Cuts 15 minutes earlier, desperate for a trim before my sister's wedding tomorrow. My regular barber booked solid, and this place the only shop with availability on a Saturday afternoon. "Yeah, just me," I answered, trying to keep my voice light, despite the sudden tension knotting my shoulders. Marcus nodded slowly and resumed cutting, but his movements had changed. Where before he'd been efficient and professional, now every snip felt deliberate, measured, like he was buying time. The barbershop was empty except for us, the other 2 chairs vacant and the waiting area deserted. A bell above the door would announce anyone entering, and I found myself hyper-aware of that potential sound. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead and classic rock played softly from speakers I couldn't see. Normalcy wrapping around something that felt increasingly abnormal. Marcus was maybe 50, with graying hair and forearms covered in faded tattoos that suggested a past more interesting than cutting hair in a strip mall. He'd been friendly when I'd first sat down, asking about my day and making standard small talk about the weather and weekend plans. But that question, "Did you come here alone?" had shifted everything. Now he worked in near silence, occasionally glancing toward the front windows like he was expecting someone or checking if anyone was watching. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a question, but my instincts screamed that something was wrong. My phone buzzed in my pocket and Marcus's eyes flicked to it immediately. "You can check that if you need to," he said, but something in his tone suggested I shouldn't. I ignored the buzz and kept my hands visible on the armrests, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was sitting in this chair, with a sharp object near my head and a stranger behind me. Marcus caught my eyes in the mirror again, and this time, he held the gaze for 3 full seconds before speaking. "How long have you lived in the area?" The question felt like a test, like my answer would determine something important. "About 6 years," I said truthfully. "Moved here for work, stayed for the cost of living." Marcus nodded and made a small sound of acknowledgement, then asked what I did for work. "I'm an accountant," I told him, wondering why any of this mattered for a haircut. Corporate taxes, mostly. Marcus's reflection smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's good. Stable work. You married?" The personal questions were escalating and I felt my heart rate increase. "No, I'm single. My sister's getting married tomorrow, that's why I needed the haircut." Marcus stopped cutting again, and this time he set the scissors down on the counter. He moved around to face me directly instead of working through the mirror, his body language deliberate and careful. "Listen, I need you to stay calm and keep your voice normal, but I'm going to tell you something important." My mouth went dry and I nodded, not trusting my voice. "There's a man who's been watching this shop for the last 10 minutes. He's parked across the street in a gray sedan, and he's been on his phone since you walked in here." Marcus spoke quietly but clearly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't think you came here by chance. I think someone sent you here specifically." The words made no sense, and I started to turn toward the window, but Marcus put a hand on my shoulder. "Don't look. Act natural. I'm going to keep cutting your hair, and you're going to sit still and listen to what I tell you." My chest tightened with fear that was rapidly replacing confusion. Marcus picked up the scissors again and resumed cutting. But now I understood he was creating a performance for whoever was watching. About 3 weeks ago, a young man came in here for a haircut. Mid-20s, nervous, kept checking his phone, asked for a specific style, very particular about how he wanted it done. Marcus trimmed around my ears while he talked, his voice low and steady. Halfway through the cut, the kid's phone rang. He answered it, and I could hear yelling on the other end, a man's voice telling him he was being stupid, that he needed to come outside right now. The kid looked terrified and hung up. That's when he asked me the same question I just asked you. Did I come here alone? I told him yes, and he started crying. Said he'd made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to get out of it. Marcus paused and met my eyes in the mirror again. 2 days later, his body was found in a parking garage downtown. Gunshot wound to the head, made to look like suicide. My blood turned to ice, and I gripped the armrests hard enough to hurt. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus continued cutting, his hands steady despite the gravity of what he was saying. "Because when you walked in today, you had the same look that kid had. Nervous, checking over your shoulder. Desperate for a haircut at the last minute. And because that gray sedan outside has been circling this block for the past hour, I watched it pass 6 times before you arrived. Then you walked in and it parked. That's not coincidence." I forced myself to breathe normally, to not react visibly to the terror flooding my system. "I don't know anyone who drives a gray sedan." Marcus shaped the back of my neck with clippers, the vibration oddly grounding against my panic. "Maybe you do, and you don't know it. Maybe someone's tracking you for reasons you're not aware of yet. Or maybe you're in some kind of situation you haven't fully recognized as dangerous." He turned off the clippers and picked up the scissors again. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need honest answers. Have you noticed anyone following you recently? Strange phone calls? People asking about your schedule or routine?" I thought back over the past few weeks and my stomach dropped as memories clicked into place with new significance. There had been a coworker who'd been unusually interested in my weekend plans, asking multiple times about my sister's wedding and where it would be held. A wrong number call to my cell phone where the person had stayed on the line silently for 30 seconds before hanging up. A car I'd seen parked outside my apartment building 3 nights in a row that I'd dismissed as belonging to a new resident. And 2 days ago, someone had tried to break into my car in the office parking garage, failing to get in but leaving scratches around the door handle. I'd reported it to building security, but hadn't connected it to anything larger. I told Marcus all of this and watched his jaw tighten. "You're in danger," he said flatly. "I don't know the specifics, but that pattern is surveillance. Someone's been watching you, learning your routine, waiting for the right opportunity. Coming here today, alone, was exactly what they wanted." My hands started shaking and I pressed them against my thighs. "What do I do?" Marcus glanced toward the window again, his expression grim. "That sedan hasn't moved. Whoever's in it is waiting for you to leave. If you walk out that door right now and get in your car, I think something bad is going to happen to you." The barbershop felt like it was closing in around me, the cheerful normalcy of it at odds with the nightmare Marcus was describing. "Why are you helping me? I don't even know you." Marcus met my eyes in the mirror, and something painful flashed across his face. "Because I didn't help that kid 3 weeks ago. I cut his hair, watched him leave terrified, and told myself it wasn't my business. Then I saw his face on the news and knew I could have done something. I'm not making that mistake twice." He set down the scissors and pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call someone I know, a detective who worked that kid's case. You're going to talk to him and tell him everything you just told me." Before I could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and both Marcus and I froze. A man walked in, maybe 40, wearing a business suit that looked expensive. He had the kind of face that was handsome but forgettable, the type you'd never pick out of a lineup. He smiled at us, the expression pleasant and empty. "Sorry to interrupt, just wondering if you have time for a quick trim?" Marcus's entire demeanor shifted, becoming aggressively cheerful. "We're all booked up today, sir, but I can get you in tomorrow morning if that works." The man's smile didn't change, but his eyes moved to me, assessing in a way that made my skin crawl. "That's all right. I'll find somewhere else." He left as quickly as he'd entered, the bell chiming his departure. Marcus immediately moved to the door and locked it, flipping the open sign to closed. "That was a test. He was checking to see if you were really alone in here, if I'd called anyone, if there was any indication you'd recognize the danger." I stood up from the chair, my legs unsteady. My haircut was half finished, one side longer than the other, but that seemed spectacularly unimportant now. "We need to get you out of here without being seen. There's a back door that leads to the alley. My car is parked behind the building. I'm going to take you somewhere safe." I followed Marcus through the back of the shop, past storage rooms filled with hair products and cleaning supplies. The back door opened into an alley that smelled like garbage and stale water, dumpsters lining the cracked asphalt. Marcus's car was an old truck with rust along the wheel wells, parked facing the alley's exit. He unlocked it, and I climbed into the passenger seat, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Marcus started the engine and pulled out slowly, checking both directions before turning away from the street where the gray sedan waited. "I'm taking you to the police station downtown," he said. "You're going to file a report, and they're going to put you in protective custody until they figure out what's going on." The drive took 15 minutes through Saturday afternoon traffic, Marcus constantly checking his mirrors for signs of pursuit. I called my sister from his phone, my own cell suddenly feeling like a tracking device I couldn't trust. I told her I'd had a car problem and would explain later that I might miss the rehearsal dinner tonight but would be at the wedding tomorrow no matter what. She was confused and irritated, but agreed to cover for me with our parents. I hung up and stared out the window at normal people doing normal weekend activities, grocery shopping and walking dogs and washing cars, all of them unaware that someone was trying to hurt me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. The police station was a concrete fortress of bureaucracy and fluorescent lighting. Marcus walked in with me and asked immediately for Detective Lawrence Campos, the investigator who'd worked the case of the dead kid from 3 weeks ago. We waited in hard plastic chairs for 20 minutes before Campos appeared, a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and coffee stains on his shirt. Marcus explained the situation, while I sat there feeling like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. Campos listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as Marcus described the gray sedan and the man who'd entered the barbershop. Campos asked to speak with me privately and led me to an interview room that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. He had me go through everything in detail: the coworkers' questions, the silent phone call, the car parked outside my building, the attempted break-in. He wrote it all down in a notebook with handwriting so messy I couldn't read it from across the table. When I finished, he asked a question that made my blood freeze. "Do you know a man named Theo Kensington?" The name was familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. Campos pulled out a photo and slid it across the table. "This is Theo Kensington. Does he look familiar?" The photo showed a young man, maybe 26, with dark hair and a nervous smile. He was the kid Marcus had mentioned, the one who'd been found dead in the parking garage. I stared at the photo, and suddenly, the memory clicked into place with horrifying clarity. I'd met him 6 months ago at a work conference in Austin. We'd talked for maybe 10 minutes in the hotel bar, a forgettable conversation about industry trends and which sessions were worth attending. I'd given him my business card because he'd mentioned needing an accountant for his startup. But he'd never called, and I'd forgotten about him completely until this moment. Campos watched my face and nodded. "You remember him now?" I told Campos about the conference and the brief conversation, my voice shaking with the implications. "Theo Kensington was killed because he was helping the FBI investigate a financial fraud scheme," Campos said. "He'd been working at a tech startup that was actually a front for money laundering. When he figured it out, he came to us with evidence. We put him in witness protection, but someone found him anyway. The parking garage shooting was made to look like suicide, but we know it was murder." Campos leaned forward, his expression grave. "The people running that operation are extremely dangerous and extremely well-connected. They have resources most criminals don't. If they think Theo gave you information or told you something important, they'll come after you to eliminate that risk." "But I don't know anything," I protested. "We barely spoke. I don't even remember what we talked about specifically." Campos pulled out another photo, this one showing multiple men in what looked like surveillance footage. "Do you recognize anyone in this photo?" I studied the faces, and my stomach dropped. The man who'd walked into the barbershop today was in the photo, standing with 3 other men outside a building I didn't recognize. "That's him," I pointed. "He came into the shop while I was there." Campos's expression turned grim. "That's Vincent Fletcher. He's an enforcer for the organization, specializes in making problems disappear quietly." The reality of how close I'd come to dying in that barbershop hit me like physical force. If Marcus hadn't asked that question, hadn't recognized the pattern, I would have walked out to my car and Fletcher would have been waiting. The gray sedan, the surveillance, all of it had been leading to that moment. Campos explained that they'd been trying to build a case against the organization for 2 years, but witnesses kept disappearing or refusing to testify. Theo had been their best chance at prosecution, and his death had set the investigation back significantly. Now Fletcher had apparently decided I was another loose end that needed cutting, even though I had no actual information to threaten them with. Campos made some calls, and within an hour, I was being transferred to a safe house in a suburb I'd never heard of. 2 federal agents drove me there in an unmarked car, both of them armed and silent. The safe house was a bland ranch-style home that could have belonged to anyone, furnished with generic furniture and stocked with frozen meals. The agents explained I'd be staying here until they determined the extent of the threat and whether protective custody was necessary long-term. They gave me a prepaid phone with only emergency numbers programmed in and told me not to contact anyone from my previous life without clearing it through them first. I spent the first night in the safe house unable to sleep, lying on an uncomfortable bed in a strange room and trying to process how my life had imploded in a single afternoon. I'd gone to get a haircut and ended up a target for a criminal organization because I'd once had a 10-minute conversation with someone who'd later become a whistleblower. The randomness of it was almost worse than if I'd done something to deserve it. I was collateral damage in someone else's criminal enterprise. My life upended because I'd been polite to a stranger at a conference. The next morning, Sunday, was my sister's wedding day. I called her from the prepaid phone and tried to explain why I wouldn't be there without revealing the full horror of what was happening. I told her I'd witnessed something dangerous and had to stay hidden for my own safety, that I loved her and was devastated to miss her day. She cried, and I cried, and our parents got on the phone demanding to know what kind of trouble I'd gotten into. I couldn't explain in ways they'd understand that I hadn't gotten into anything, that trouble had found me through the most mundane of coincidences. Agent Tran, one of my handlers, knocked on my bedroom door mid-morning and told me Detective Campos was on his way to the safe house with an update. I dressed quickly and met them in the living room, where Campos looked even more exhausted than yesterday. "Vincent Fletcher was arrested an hour ago," he said without preamble. "We put surveillance on him after your identification yesterday and caught him meeting with 2 other organization members. They were planning to go to your apartment tonight and wait for you to come home." Campos showed me photos from the surveillance, Fletcher and 2 other men standing beside a vehicle containing weapons and restraints. The images made me physically ill because they represented what would have happened if Marcus hadn't intervened. I'd have gotten my hair cut, gone home to prepare for the wedding, and opened my door to men with guns and duct tape. My absence from my sister's wedding would have been permanent, my family never knowing what had happened to me, my body maybe never being found at all. Campos explained that Fletcher's arrest had been strategic, timed to prevent the attack while not alerting the larger organization that they'd been compromised. They were hoping Fletcher would flip and provide information about his employers in exchange for a reduced sentence. But there was a complication. Fletcher's lawyer had already made clear that his client would only cooperate if given full immunity and entrance into witness protection. The same organization that had killed Theo was too powerful for Fletcher to testify against without complete protection, and the FBI was debating whether the information he could provide was worth that deal. Meanwhile, the organization would know Fletcher had been arrested and would be trying to determine why. If they figured out he'd been caught planning to kill me, they'd know I was still alive and potentially under federal protection. That made me either a valuable target or a non-issue depending on what they thought I knew. Campos explained that I had two options. Option one was to remain in protective custody indefinitely while they built their case, possibly for months or even years, my entire life on hold while federal agents tried to dismantle a criminal enterprise. Option two was to become an active participant in the investigation, to work with them to draw out more members of the organization and gather evidence that could lead to prosecutions. Both options were dangerous, but the second one at least gave me agency in my own survival. I thought about my sister's wedding happening without me, about my parents' worried calls, about my life being stolen by circumstances beyond my control. I chose option two because hiding forever felt like dying slowly. Agent Tran explained the plan carefully, making sure I understood the risks. They wanted me to return to my normal life while wearing a wire and being constantly monitored. The organization would eventually learn I was still alive and would try to assess what I knew. Federal agents would be nearby at all times, ready to intervene if I was approached. My apartment would be fitted with hidden cameras and listening devices. My car would have a tracking device installed. Every phone call, every email, every movement would be documented and analyzed for threats. My life would be normal on the surface, but underneath it would be a carefully orchestrated operation designed to lure criminals into exposing themselves. The preparation took a week. I was trained on how to wear a wire without being detected, how to have conversations that would elicit incriminating responses, how to signal for help if I felt threatened. I practiced scenarios with agents playing the roles of organization members, learning to stay calm under pressure and keep talking even when terrified. They taught me about the organization's structure, showed me photos of known members and associates, briefed me on the extent of their criminal activities. Money laundering was just the beginning. They were involved in fraud, extortion, drug trafficking, and murder for hire. Theo had stumbled into their operation accidentally, but I was walking into it deliberately. Returning to my apartment felt surreal after a week away. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt safe anymore. I knew about the hidden cameras in my living room and bedroom, the microphones in my kitchen and bathroom that would turn off when I showered to give me minimal privacy. Agent Tran and his partner Agent DeMarco were stationed in a van down the street, monitoring all the feeds 24 hours a day. Another team watched my office building, ready to respond if anything happened during work hours. I was never actually alone, but I felt profoundly isolated, cut off from everyone I knew by secrets I couldn't share. My coworker Daniel approached me on my first day back, asking where I'd been and if everything was okay. I gave the cover story the FBI had prepared about a family emergency that had required me to leave town suddenly. Daniel seemed concerned and genuine, asking if there was anything he could do to help. I studied his face, trying to determine if his earlier questions about my sister's wedding had been innocent small talk or calculated surveillance. The FBI had vetted him and found nothing suspicious, but I'd learned that dangerous people often looked completely normal. I thanked him for his concern and returned to my desk, hyper-aware of the wire taped to my ribs and the agents listening to every word. 3 days passed without incident, and I started to wonder if the organization had decided I wasn't worth the risk. Then, on Thursday evening, my doorbell rang at 8 p.m. I checked the peephole and saw a woman I'd never met before, professionally dressed and holding a clipboard. I texted the code word to Agent Tran that meant I was answering the door to an unknown person. He responded immediately with instructions to engage, but stay in the doorway. Agents were already moving into position in the hallway. I opened the door, but kept my body blocking entry to the apartment. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled and introduced herself as Rebecca from apartment management, doing a survey about resident satisfaction. Her story would have been believable, except I'd lived here 6 years and had never seen her before, and apartment management had never done satisfaction surveys in person. I answered her questions politely while watching her eyes constantly move past me, trying to see into my apartment. She asked if I lived alone, if I worked regular hours, if I traveled frequently. Each question felt like gathering intelligence. When she finally left, Agent Tran called immediately to confirm they'd photographed her and were running facial recognition. The woman was identified within hours as Melissa Ortiz, a known associate of the organization who specialized in reconnaissance. Her presence at my door meant they'd confirmed I was alive and were assessing the situation. The FBI ramped up security, adding more agents to the surveillance team and installing additional security measures on my apartment door. Campos came to brief me in person, his expression grim. "They're testing your defenses, seeing how close they can get. This will escalate. The next contact won't be a woman with a clipboard. It'll be someone more dangerous making a more aggressive approach. We need you to be ready." Ready meant different things to the FBI than it did to me. They wanted me prepared to gather evidence. I wanted to be prepared to survive. Agent Tran gave me a panic button that looked like a regular keychain, told me to keep it with me constantly. Pressing it would bring a response team within 90 seconds. He also gave me basic self-defense training, teaching me vulnerable points to strike if I was grabbed, how to create distance from an attacker, how to run in ways that made me harder to target. The training was practical, but terrifying, because it assumed a scenario where agents couldn't reach me in time, where I'd be fighting for my own survival against people who killed professionally. The next approach came during my lunch break on Friday. I was eating a sandwich in the park near my office building when a man sat down on the bench beside me. He was well-dressed and clean-cut, exactly the type who'd blend into a corporate environment. He didn't speak immediately, just sat eating his own lunch like his presence was coincidental. Then after 5 minutes, he turned to me casually. "You're Andrew Mercer, right? Work at Davidson and Associates?" My hand moved to the panic button on my keychain, but I kept my voice steady. "Yeah. Do I know you?" The man smiled, and it was the most frightening smile I'd ever seen, all teeth and no warmth. "No, but we have a mutual friend. Theo Kensington." My chest tightened with fear, but I forced myself to look confused. "I don't think I know anyone by that name." The man's smile widened. "Really? Because Theo told me he'd given you some important information about 6 months ago. Information about a business opportunity he was concerned about." I shook my head, maintaining the confusion. I meet a lot of people at conferences. If I talk to someone named Theo, I don't remember it, and I definitely didn't receive any information about business opportunities. The man studied me for a long moment, and I could feel him trying to determine if I was lying. Agent Tran's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece I was wearing. "Stay calm. We're 60 seconds out. Keep him talking." I took a bite of my sandwich, projecting casual confusion rather than terror. The man finally spoke again, his voice friendly, but carrying an undertone of threat. "Here's the thing, Andrew. Theo was involved in something he shouldn't have been, and before he died he mentioned your name. We just want to make sure he didn't burden you with information that might cause you problems. I can be very helpful to people who cooperate with me." I set down my sandwich and faced him directly. "I genuinely don't know what you're talking about. I might have met someone named Theo at a conference. I meet dozens of people at those events, but I didn't receive any information from anyone about anything suspicious or concerning. If your friend was involved in something bad, I'm sorry, but I'm not connected to it in any way." The man's expression hardened slightly. "You're sure about that? Because the people I work with are very thorough. If you're lying to me now, it will be much worse for you later than if you just tell me the truth now." The threat was barely veiled, and I felt my pulse racing. "I'm not lying. I'm an accountant. I go to work. I file taxes. I live a boring life. Whatever you think I know, you're wrong." Agent Tran's voice came through again. 30 seconds. We need him to make a more explicit threat or mention the organization. Push him a little." I forced myself to lean forward slightly, projecting frustration rather than fear. "Look, I don't know who you are or why you think I'm involved in whatever this is about, but you need to leave me alone. I don't have information about anything, and I don't want to be harassed during my lunch break." The man's friendly facade dropped completely. "You should be very careful about who you tell to leave you alone. My colleagues aren't as patient as I am. If Theo told you anything at all, anything about accounts or transactions or people he was concerned about, you need to tell me now. This is your last chance to avoid serious problems." Before I could respond, 3 federal agents appeared from different directions, moving fast and purposeful. The man saw them and stood immediately, hands up in a gesture of innocence. "Is there a problem, officers?" Agent DeMarco flashed his badge and told the man to put his hands behind his head. The man complied, but his eyes never left mine, promising retribution for this interference. They arrested him right there in the park, cuffing him while reading his rights. I sat on the bench shaking, my sandwich forgotten, watching them lead him to an unmarked car. Agent Tran came over and told me I'd done well, that the wire had captured everything including direct threats that could be used as evidence. The man's name was David Cross, a mid-level enforcer for the organization who'd apparently been sent to assess whether I actually had information worth killing me for. His threats had been clear enough to charge him with intimidation and conspiracy, and the FBI was hoping he'd follow Fletcher's lead and flip on his employers rather than face decades in prison. But Cross's arrest meant the organization now knew I was under federal protection. They'd tested my defenses twice, and both times had encountered immediate law enforcement response. That would make them more cautious, but also more determined if they decided I remained a threat. Campos called an emergency meeting at the safe house that evening to discuss next steps. The investigation had gathered significant evidence from Fletcher and Cross's arrests, but the leadership remained untouchable. Both men were small fish protecting bigger fish, and neither would testify without guarantees that were difficult to provide. Campos explained that they were considering a more aggressive strategy. Instead of waiting for the organization to come after me, they wanted to use me as bait in a controlled operation designed to draw out leadership. They'd set up a scenario where I appeared to be trying to sell information Theo had supposedly given me, information valuable enough to require senior organization members to respond. It was dangerous and depended on perfect execution, but it could provide the evidence needed to dismantle the entire operation. I listened to the plan and understood I was being asked to paint a target on my back and trust that federal agents would keep me alive. I thought about Theo dying in that parking garage, about Marcus's guilt for not helping him. I thought about my sister's wedding that I'd missed, about my life that had been stolen by random chance and criminal malice. I thought about the other potential victims who might cross paths with these people in the future, who might have their lives destroyed or ended because a criminal organization operated with impunity. I told Campos I'd do it. that I wanted to help end this even if it meant risking everything. Agent Tran looked at me like I was crazy, but Campos just nodded, probably having seen that same desperate determination in other people whose lives had been shattered by circumstances beyond their control. The operation took 2 weeks to plan and execute. The FBI created a fake email account and sent messages to known organization intermediaries, hinting that I had financial records Theo had given me and was willing to sell for the right price. The emails were crafted to seem naive and greedy, the work of someone who didn't understand how dangerous the information was or who they were dealing with. The organization took the bait, responding through encrypted channels and arranging a meeting to see the supposed evidence before committing to any payment. The meeting location was set for a warehouse district downtown, an area the FBI could control and monitor. I arrived at the warehouse on a Wednesday evening, driving my own car but with a tracking device and 5 federal vehicles in coordinated positions around the area. I wore a wire sophisticated enough to capture audio even in high-noise environments and had a panic button sewn into my jacket lining. Agent Tran was in my earpiece, calmly walking me through each step. Inside the warehouse, 3 men were waiting. One I recognized from photos as Gerald Whitmore, a high-ranking member of the organization who rarely appeared in person. His presence meant they were taking the supposed information seriously enough to risk exposing leadership. Whitmore was in his 60s, distinguished and professional-looking, exactly the type who could run criminal enterprises while appearing legitimate. He greeted me cordially and asked to see what I'd brought. I pulled out a folder of documents the FBI had prepared, real-looking but ultimately fake financial records showing money laundering patterns. Whitmore studied them carefully, asking technical questions designed to test whether I understood what I was looking at. I answered using the script the FBI had prepared, playing the role of an accountant who'd stumbled onto corruption and was smart enough to recognize its value, but naive about the consequences of possessing it. Whitmore seemed satisfied and named a price for the documents, a ridiculous amount that no legitimate buyer would offer. I agreed enthusiastically, and he smiled, signaling to his companions. That's when everything went wrong. One of the men moved behind me, and I felt something press against my spine, hard and unmistakable. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped the friendly pretense. You were very clever about setting this up, bringing federal protection, wearing a wire. We knew about all of it. This was never about buying information. This was about demonstrating what happens to people who interfere with our operations. Terror flooded through me as I realized they'd known it was a trap from the beginning and had walked in anyway. Agent Tran's voice screamed in my ear to get down, that teams were moving in, but the man behind me had a firm grip on my jacket. Whitmore continued speaking, his tone conversational despite the gun pressed to my back. Theo Kensington thought he was clever too, thought the FBI could protect him. But we own people in places you'd never expect. We knew about the safe house location, knew about the parking garage plan, knew everything, just like we knew about this meeting tonight. The gun pressed harder and I heard the safety click off. Then chaos erupted. The warehouse doors crashed open from 3 directions and federal agents poured in with weapons drawn. The man holding me tried to use me as a shield, but Agent DeMarco was faster, tackling him from the side and sending both of us sprawling to the concrete floor. Gunfire exploded in the enclosed space, deafening and disorienting. I covered my head with my arms and tried to make myself as small as possible while shouting erupted around me. Someone grabbed my jacket and dragged me toward the door. Agent Tran's voice, breathless and urgent, telling me to move, to run, that they had me. Outside the warehouse, more vehicles had arrived and the area was swarmed with federal agents. Someone pushed me into an SUV and we were moving before the door closed, speeding away from the scene. Agent Tran was beside me checking for injuries, his hands shaking slightly as adrenaline worked through his system. I was unhurt physically, but in shock, unable to process how close I'd come to dying. Tran explained that they'd intercepted communications from inside the organization revealing the meeting was an ambush, but they'd decided to proceed anyway to arrest Whitmore and his associates. The gamble had worked, but barely. All 3 men were in custody, and the warehouse was being processed for evidence. The aftermath took months. Whitmore and his associates refused to cooperate, hiring expensive lawyers and dragging out the legal process. But the evidence gathered from the warehouse meeting, combined with testimony from Fletcher and Cross, who'd both accepted plea deals, was enough to indict 17 members of the organization on charges ranging from money laundering to murder conspiracy. The trial made national news, exposing the scope of the criminal enterprise and the systemic failures that had allowed it to operate for over a decade. I testified about my experiences, about Theo's death and the attempts on my life, about the warehouse ambush where Whitmore had admitted they'd known about federal protection but had proceeded anyway. The jury convicted all 17 defendants. Whitmore received life in prison without parole. The others got sentences ranging from 20 to 50 years. The organization was effectively dismantled, its financial networks frozen and assets seized. But the victory felt hollow because Theo was still dead, because I'd spent months of my life in terror, because my sense of safety had been permanently destroyed. I couldn't walk down the street without scanning for threats or return to my apartment without checking every room. The trauma wasn't something that ended with convictions and sentences. I visited Marcus's barbershop 6 months after the trial concluded, needing to see him and thank him properly for saving my life. He was cutting someone's hair when I walked in, but he recognized me immediately despite my vastly different haircut from another barber. When his customer left, we talked for over an hour about everything that had happened, about Theo and the investigation and the trial. Marcus said he'd followed the news coverage closely, had felt some measure of redemption knowing his intervention had led to the organization's destruction. He'd started training other barbers and service workers to recognize signs of danger, turning his guilt about Theo into action that might save others. A year later, I moved to a different city for a fresh start, accepting a job that paid less but offered distance from the memories soaked into every street corner of my old life. My sister forgave me for missing her wedding after learning the full story, and we grew closer through the shared understanding that life could shatter in an instant without warning. I never walk into businesses alone anymore, without noting exits and assessing everyone present. Never ignore gut feelings about situations that seem slightly wrong. And I always answer honestly when someone asks if I came alone, because that question once saved my life when a barber recognized danger I couldn't see. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.